Jeff, why don't we skip the break till later because we've got Dan Good joining us. Dan, we're just talking about Joe Girardi and the wonderful Phillies bullpen because nothing going on here in Philly sports today, right?
No, not at all.
Well, wait, Dan, before we start, you have your book there, and we want to talk about your book, but you also have a bobblehead there. Which bobblehead is it?
It's a bobblehead of Ken Caminiti. It's
look at that.
the Padres did a giveaway a couple seasons ago. They actually it was honoring the 1998 team, and it was Greg Vaughn, Trevor Hoffman, and Tony Gwynn and Ken.
That was a fun team. All right, we brought him on quick because we were talking about Joe Girardi, baseball man, with his latest biography, author of the new biography this week about baseball star Ken Caminiti, Playing Through the Pain. Dan Good. Dan, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is pretty cool. You're out there. Tell us what it means for you to hold your book this week as it gets released and gets some pretty good reviews from people. I don't say that as surprising, by the way, just kind of for our audience.
It's surreal. It's surreal to actually hold this book and even listen to the audiobook. I was listening to the audiobook on the day of release, and he's reading back my words, and it was so surreal and strange. And, people are taking pictures of it at baseball stadiums or across the country or finding it in bookstores in Nashville. And I'm like, that's my book. It's out there. It's so interesting to carry around the story for so long and then have it out in the world. And, now you're, waiting for the reactions to come in, waiting for people to finish reading. Reactions I've gotten so far have been positive, but it's always scary and exciting and interesting.
One of the things when we have authors like you on talking about subjects like this, we're always interested to find out how hard was it to have people talk to you about the subject, especially such a touchy subject within the sport of baseball.
It wasn't easy. And there were certainly people close to Ken who were guarded and reticent and concerned about talking, concerned about what kind of angle, what motive I had in coming forward with this story. And it took time. There were some people who decided they weren't going to talk to me, and I completely respect that decision. And other people, as I started talking to more and more people, they said, okay, well, if you talk to this person, I'll talk to you too. And and then sometimes you keep trying, and over a couple of years, they finally say yes. And it was meaningful to be able to, bring those walls down a little bit. But it was tough. It was tough with a story like Ken's, with a topic like steroids and addiction and drug abuse. It was a really tough thing to break down those walls.
Well, one of those people that you spoke to was Bruce Bochy. And from what we hear, it wasn't the easiest thing to get a hold of. What was that experience like getting a hold of him, and what happened?
I spent years going through the Giants when he was managing the Giants, trying to get him. They actually gave me a 10-minute window to talk to him at a Mets game in, I think it was 2014, but I had a family commitment and I couldn't make it. I had to cancel, which was disappointing, but I also knew I needed more than 10 minutes anyway. So, what was the point? So the years go by. I reach out to them every couple months, every season. Hey, how's it going? Maybe this year we can make this happen. And then he announced his retirement, and you kind of, at one point it was really disappointing. But then on the other point, I said, I'll just take this into my own hands. I don't have to worry about the Giants anymore. So in 2020, I had a couple numbers of his that I thought might be connected to him, but I wasn't sure. I called the numbers. One went through. I left a message and saved it into my phone as Bruce Bochy ? And didn't know what to expect. And a week or two later, I got a call back, and I assumed it might be a wrong number, but I answered it, and there's that gravelly voice. There's Bruce Bochy. We ended up setting a time and talking for 45 minutes, and that was really special. Another one that I kind of went to similar means to get was actually Bobby Cox. And this was 5-6 years ago. This is before some of the health issues he's faced. But I called him. I called the number associated with him, and he answered the phone, and he said, "A tree just fell on my house. Can you call me tomorrow?" And I said, sure, happy to. So I called him the next day, and we ended up talking for 10 or 15 minutes, and he filled in some gaps for me. And it's like, this is Bobby Cox. This is Bruce Bochy. It's neat to talk to these guys.
Call me back after I take the tree off my house. One of the people you talked to was the man who wrote the original SI piece, Tom Verducci. Tell us about talking to Tom and how Caminiti's story was really the catalyst to the larger Sports Illustrated investigation.
Talking to Tom was also a challenge because he's difficult to track down. He's not on Twitter. He doesn't have an easily accessible email address. I actually found a business card of his on eBay that was being sold that had a phone number on it. And I called that number. And
that's reporting.
Yes. That's how I found Tom Verducci. So and the interesting thing about it was, obviously this was a major story for his career, and he should be proud of it. He did a great job. It's interesting looking at the genesis of that story and how it started actually with the CNNSI producer, Jules Bailey, who had been, interested in reporting on steroids in baseball. She calls Ken. Ken says, "Hey, I'm at this motorcycle rally in Nevada. Come on out. I have nothing to hide. Bring a camera." So he does this on-camera interview with Jules and admits to using steroids. And because CNNSI was shutting down, they said, let's give this story to Tom Verducci to advance in the magazine for Sports Illustrated. Let's let him carry this forward, which is pretty common in bigger outlets like that. And he got the story. He went down to Houston. He had been subsequently, simultaneously, as Jules was, interested in the story, like a lot of other people, he was also focused on this. And he had heard from a lot of other clean players who were complaining to him. Brian Johnson, the former catcher, was one of them. There were so many players who were frustrated and upset that this playing field wasn't level, and they wanted some exposure, some credible, realistic reporting on this. And they were really asking for help. And, Caminiti's interested in talking. Tom Verducci went down to Texas to Ken's house and met with him there and talked over a couple hours. And, Ken just didn't hold back. He just, he was out of rehab. He was interested in, owning his truth and being honest and open. And he didn't, in his mind, have anything to hide. So he didn't hold back. And, the story is full of some white truths, half truths, white lies. There were some things that he fudged a little bit to protect people close to him. But at the end of the day, this was an MVP saying, I used steroids to win my MVP award. I don't regret using steroids. That was a huge moment in baseball, a huge story, and it was a firestorm. It really set in motion a lot of the reforms and changes that would come in the years ahead.
We talk about somebody like Jose Canseco and why he did it. And people questioned his motives at the time. Ken Caminiti comes out. What did you learn from writing this book and researching this book about what his real motivation was and what a struggle it was for him to deal with the after effects of him coming out?
It really was all about honesty and truth and moving forward with his life. I really think he was interested in letting teams know that, he was moving in the right direction. He gets arrested in this Houston hotel room in late 2001, which is a huge issue, a huge mess. It's basically the end of his career. Like, no team's going to take a chance on him after that happened. And I think he wanted to let teams know that he was following the right path and moving forward with his life in a good direction. So I think that was a big reason for him wanting to come forward. And, he just wanted to be honest and open and look to a future in his life. And he wasn't expecting that firestorm. There's no way he was expecting it. There was so many players who came forward blasting him, trashing him, calling him a rat. There was certainly some that were concerned or expressed, sensitivity or sympathy for him. But so many of them were just trashing him. And it's kind of ironic and sad because some of those players who are coming forward, and criticizing him are getting steroids from the same places he was, and it's really that 50% total, which it's kind of interesting too, because so many players over those years put out different numbers. 30%, Jose Canseco was 85%, which still seems really, really high. There's no way it was that high, but whatever the number is, Ken throws out a number and these other players just focused on that and couldn't get past that. And it was a real shame. And, in the years ahead, in the final years of his life, he really struggled with those situations where he was around the game. He came back in 2003 to San Diego for the close of the stadium, and he was worried he was going to get booed. He was worried how his other fellow players are going to act around him, how they were going to feel about him. And so many people loved him and adored him, and yet he was worried about the repercussions and the boos and, people criticizing him. And it's a shame because he was so beloved and so appreciated.
Do you think he would have gotten the pushback he did if he just said, I did it, without saying 50% of baseball's doing it? Is that what really created the firestorm, that putting that onus on the player to prove that he wasn't that one out of every two people using, according to Ken Caminiti?
I think that was a big part of it, and I think that it was just an offhand comment. That's what's so silly about it. It was an offhand comment. Tom asked him how many, what percentage he thinks. As people ask me, what percentage do you think are using? I have no idea, but I don't think there was really a clear way of knowing. But he throws out this number, and I think the players really struggled with that number because it basically means, which camp are you in? Are you in this camp or are you in that camp? And every single player is now potentially part of that 50%. And, Ken's credibility on this topic was really high. I mean, he had nothing to gain. He was not trying to burn bridges. He was simply telling the truth. And that truth was difficult and complicated for Major League Baseball to have to confront in public.
You said that Ken's disclosure was bigger than sports. It was a national news story, a black eye for the national pastime. We saw congressional hearings. We saw changes in law. Can you expand on the impact that this had outside of the lines of the baseball field?
I mean, it was mentioned at the State of the Union address in 2004, not specifically Ken, but I really think it was a big part of, George W. Bush is talking about performance enhancing drugs in sports and athletics and the message it sends for kids. It was a bigger thing. I mean, it's ahead of stories about the Middle East war. It's ahead of stories about Catholic church sex abuse on the day of the release. And, it just set repercussions throughout the game and throughout society. At that point in time, with the McGwire, Sosa home run chase, with Barry Bonds, I feel like baseball was a bigger part of the conversation on a national level than maybe it is today. For Ken to come forward, it really just sent ripple effects throughout the athletic world, throughout the country. It's really something when you see Washington weighing in and getting involved. And really that public pressure was what forced the Major League Baseball Players Association to finally agree to even, some basic rounds of drug testing, because up to that point they were strongly against it, and they didn't want to budge at all. And that really forced their hand to say, okay, we'll agree to a limited testing program. And if 5% of players test positive next year, then it will, ramp up and increase. And it really just kind of set everything in motion from there. But it was a massive thing. I mean, it was a massive story. You look at Sports Illustrated and the fact that 10 years later, they're putting it on the cover again, saying 10 years after this huge story, let's talk about it some more. It was a major flashpoint in sports, and it was a major flashpoint in baseball.
Oh, and that leads me to an interesting point, which is this is a book. It takes years to write a book and research a book like this. As time went on and we got a little further away from the admission, did you find that people were less likely or more likely to talk about the subject?
That's a really good question. I think that because of Ken's connection to this, I was actually able to ask questions into steroids and PEDs in baseball in a way that wasn't as direct, because I could say, what was your reaction when he came forward? And then it opens up new lines of questioning. Based on that, it was really interesting to be able to talk to players and managers and people around the game for that reason. With that said, I think that players of that time period have become entrenched in their own talking points and positions. So even when this topic comes up, they kind of already have this answer in mind. They will only go so far. They might say, it's a shame that this had to happen. It's a shame about this era. I was playing clean, and it's a shame that other players from my era were using, and I get, implicated in that, that it wasn't a level playing field. Players are going to do what they're going to do. So they've kind of gotten entrenched in the answers that they give or the positions within the conversation that they will provide. And it's fascinating because even all these years later, they're not really open to admitting to what they're doing because of the stigma surrounding it. And that stigma still exists even 20 years later.
It's interesting you say that because a few years ago, I was lucky enough to have a one-on-one conversation with Bud Selig when he had his book out. And I tried to push him because I grew up in the chicks dig the long ball advertising era. Like that was targeted at me. I was going to college. I was watching.
Well, not because you hit the long ball.
No, not at all.
Right. Okay. Let's just make that clear.
I was watching McGuire, Sosa Chase. Selig wouldn't engage on it at all. It was just a willful ignorance of saying, no, we did not benefit from steroids, when in reality, baseball came back on the back of steroids being taken by their players. Is that a common thing that, you see it, they want to not put them in the Hall of Fame. They want to not they want to make the era go away. Is that even possibly realistic for them? Or where does this conversation end about steroids in baseball?
You're exactly right. And I've been frustrated at that point. I mean, Bud Selig was being interviewed and asked about steroids as early as 1995. You had players at different points, 1998, coming forward complaining, that this game wasn't balanced and fair. This was happening. This was open. It's really disappointing that people like Bud Selig, owners, managers, other people around the game have been able to benefit or skate responsibility when everybody in the game deserves that connection to it. Everybody who was in the game at that point in time is a part of this. This isn't just the players by themselves, and they should be held accountable, and Barry Bonds should be out of the Hall of Fame. If Bud Selig's in the Hall of Fame, and there's other players from that era who are in the Hall of Fame, including some such as David Ortiz, who have faced drug scrutiny, questions about whether they failed a drug test. It really goes beyond this. And it's really disappointing where we have these moral ambiguities and these boundaries set up where, this person needs to be held accountable, but not this person. I don't see that. And I think that ultimately, people like Bud Selig bear a big share of the responsibility as well for this. It's not just the players. I mean, the players were doing this because contracts were on the line. Careers were on the line. They needed to stay in the lineup. They wanted to get salaries. They wanted to get paid. They wanted to get opportunities. There's so much money on the line. What do you expect? So it's really disingenuous, I think, when people shy away from that topic or try to avoid responsibility for something that was happening in all of baseball. It wasn't just the players.
Dan, before we let you go, and this is a great book and everybody should go out and get it. Since we have you on, I got to just ask you, you also were involved in the Nucky Johnson documentary. How much fun was it doing the research in that documentary?
Digging deep. I adored Nucky. He was so fascinating. It was interesting diving into, Southern New Jersey history, looking at his influence as this political boss and really just, developing Atlantic City for what it was. And, obviously he had some gangster connections and, his story was interesting because you look at the HBO show and it doesn't have anything to do with who this guy actually was. He doesn't even look like him. So it was kind of weird and jarring to see the show and know that the reality is so much different than what was presented on air. But it was a fascinating story. And I ultimately think I've been drawn to these kind of forgotten or overlooked people. And obviously Nelson Johnson did a great job with the book about Nucky. But no, it's a fascinating time. 1920s Atlantic City seems like it was a really neat place.
Look, I worked in Jersey politics for 20 years along with being a radio show host. So I'm with you on that. It's a fascinating tale of story.
Dan will be doing a documentary on you someday.
No, but plenty of the people that I worked for are probably up for that. Dan Good, we encourage everybody to go out and get this new book, Playing Through the Pain, the biography of Ken Caminiti. Thank you so much for the time and talking about that era with us. We wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
You have a great day.
You too.